Alright guys, after years I've finally got my fully analog rig put together. Custom made in the USA Gibson, a 5150 fully analog tubes baby, and a custom built cabinet. I'm now ready to sound like a guitar god. Here we go. Yeah! Minions and mortals, this is Fang from Lords of the Trident. I am still in quarantine, and my hair looks like an emo kid. I'm sorry! So let's get to today's topic. There's an active culture war going on in the music world between analog aficionados and digital denizens, especially in the world of guitar playing and recording. Those in the analog camp have a common view that drum samples are the devil, quantizing is a mortal sin, and digital amp modelers sound nowhere near as good as their real-life counterparts. One of the loudest voices, and we need loud parts too, on this subject is Glen Fricker of Spectre Sound Studios. If you've ever watched any of Glen's content, and I do recommend subscribing to his channel because he is genuinely entertaining and informative, you'll know that Glen is no friend to those who live in the digital world. He is very vocal about his dislike for digital amps and drum sample replacement, touting that the real thing will always sound better. And ladies and gentlemen, minions and mortals, Glen Fricker is kind of wrong. Now, let me be clear. I think Glen is an awesome person. I've had the pleasure of meeting and being on a podcast with him at NAMM.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
And he's a super fun guy to hang out with. And I know that his viewpoints come from a good place. He is genuinely passionate about engineering and getting the best tone possible on his recordings. But I think his general dismissal of all things digital in the studio can cause real, tangible problems for those who follow his viewpoint as if it were gospel. And here's why. Problem number one, your gear isn't bad, you're bad.
Man, dude, if I could only find one of those $5,000 limited edition bias modded 5150s with the matching cab, then I'd finally sound exactly like Van Halen, man.
There are a lot of musicians who blame their lack of good tone on the fact that they don't have a specific set of very high-end gear. Here's a newsflash for you. If you can't dial in a good tone on mid-level equipment like this PV Valve King head, you're not going to be able to do it on a super high-end amp either. Dialing in good tone is something that takes time to learn. And besides that, most of your tone is going to come from your playing technique. The other 35% or so is going to come from your rig. Give Kirk Hammett of Metallica a Marshall or a crank or a 5150, and as long as you throw a wah pedal somewhere in the loop, he's still going to sound like Kirk Hammett.
Yeah, I think you got a point there, my friend.
If you get caught in the belief that only high-end analog gear is going to make you sound a certain way, then you're likely to put your focus on an eternal quest for the right amp, instead of the thing that really matters, your playing technique. You'll fetishize gear over talent, which leads to our next problem. Problem number two. Tone blindness. I'll admit, there is something very visceral about a real amp going through a real cab, pushing real air behind you on stage. It does feel good to be loud sometimes. But if you believe that only this one specific high-end amp will make you sound good, then you can convince yourself of that whether it's true or not. Let's say you do get that super rare, vintage, crazy high-end amp that you've always dreamed of, and for one reason or another, it sounds like crap next to your plain old Marshall head. You might believe so vehemently that this is the only amp for you that you'll disregard the evidence right in front of your ears. This is a problem that I think is much less likely to happen on digital amp modelers, especially the models that have like 1,000 amps in them. Does a 5150 really sound better than a Marshall under your fingers? How about an orange head versus a PV head? With a digital modeler, you can play around with different amps to your heart's content without being blinded by the cost or the rarity of what you have sitting in front of you. Problem number three. Wait, man, we can't record yet! One of the points that Glen makes, which I 100% agree with, is that it is incredibly important to find a great, passionate studio engineer to record and mix your records. But what if that recording engineer needs to be you? This channel and my general outlook on the music business is fiercely DIY, and so I'm not gonna tell any band that it's wrong to try and record themselves. Now, if I was in Glen's studio and I had the choice to use his actual 5150 instead of my digital 5150, would I do it? Yeah, probably. But my point here is that there are thousands of bands that are not yet in the financial situation to record in a nice studio like Glen's. And if they don't give themselves permission to start making something, they will never make anything. If they get the impression that only fancy analog gear will do, then they might never be in a financial situation to get a recording done. Why? Well, I book bands at a venue here in town, and if a band doesn't have a recording, I'm probably not going to book them. If they don't play shows, then they don't make money, or even worse, they lose their songwriting momentum because they're sitting on an album of songs that hasn't been recorded yet. If a band doesn't think they can record or perform with what they've got, then they won't record or perform with what they've got. If it's easier for a band to start teaching themselves about recording or dialing in the right tone or finding out what kind of amp or pedals they like by using digital simulations, then I say go for it. I'd much rather that a band record a decent sounding album using amp sims and drum replacement rather than a rushed, barely mixed monstrosity because they ran out of money doing it right. You pay by the hour in a studio, but not in your basement. If bands feel like they're allowed to use amp sims to record their own guitar parts, then they can take the time to get their performances perfect and then use that likely thousands of dollars they just saved in studio time to hire a really talented mixing and mastering agent. And heck, if they hire Glen and he hates their tone, he can just use the DI track to reamp the damn tracks anyway. Recorded music is forever. And I agree with Glen that you should absolutely spend the money to get it done right. But if you don't have the money, and a lot of young bands don't, then you should use every tool at your disposal to get it sounding as good as you can. And that means quantizing, sample replacement, and amp sims. Do the fans deserve better? Well, you're not going to get any fans if your recordings either don't exist or sound like hot garbage. But instead of me continuing to blather on, let's pull in a real expert here. If you've ever read any of the magazines, Guitar Player, Keyboard, Sound on Sound, Electronic Musician, then you are familiar with Craig Anderton. He's mastered hundreds of tracks. He's played Carnegie Hall. He's written thousands of articles. The man is an absolute god of music tech.
What I use amp sims for is to get sounds that I can't get with physical amps, or that would be difficult to get with physical amps. Like, I love multiband distortion. Multiband distortion is, to me, it's what every guitarist wants, clean distortion. I know that that's a paradox, but it focuses the distortion so well, because when you hit the low strings, it doesn't influence the high strings. When you hit the high strings, it doesn't influence the low strings. You can do things with multiband distortion, like pull the drive way back on the high frequencies so that you don't get any harshness in the distortion, and the strings really ring out. Meanwhile, you can put a ton of distortion on the low strings and the lower mids and get that big beefy kind of sound. Now, you can't do that with a regular amp. So if you want that sound, your only option is to get a multiband crossover piece of hardware, multiple amps, a ton of mics, set all the controls correctly on the crossover and the amps, and I mean, it would just be insane. To disregard amp sims simply means that you're not capable of thinking outside of this conventional idea that an amp has to be a speaker in a cabinet with tubes. You know, it doesn't work that way. It's just another tool. I mean, look, when I'm old enough to remember when people said that using EQ and echo was cheating. You know, it's like, oh, they put reverb on these people to make these teen idols sound good, but they can't sing, you know, and the same with EQ. So, I mean, there's always been this backlash type of thing.
I know a lot of you out there are either using amp sims or are interested in using amp sims, so stick around to the end of the video where Craig is going to give you some concrete steps to make your amp sim sound as good as, maybe even better, than a real amp. But first, I'm wondering, what is it about amp sims that turns people off from using them?
Well, they think it's plug and play. I mean, a guitar amp is plug and play. You plug in, you turn up the volume to 11, and you're done, you know. But the thing is, you can't do much with it aside from that. I mean, you can have something like the Line 6 had their DT25, which got a bunch of different sounds. You can change the input tubes on a PV Windsor. I mean, it's designed to do that. I mean, but you can only take that so far. And the thing is, do you want to make sounds that already exist, or do you want to make sounds that never existed before? And if you listen to the stuff I've been doing recently, it's all pretty much, almost all the chord stuff is multi-band distortion. And it's really hard to differentiate. I mean, it's really hard to tell exactly what's going on because it's a new type of sound. Now, people, you know, an engineer will tell you that what the secret to getting a good sound with an amp is the miking, and they'll spend hours choosing the right mic, choosing whether it's like right out at the center of the cone, whether it's off to the side to make it warmer, whether it's angled, whether they pick up room sound along with it. I mean, miking a guitar amp is not easy to do it right. You know, I mean, yeah, you can stick a mic in front of an amp and then wonder why it doesn't sound any good. But to really mic a guitar amp well takes a lot of effort. And basically, I think that what I do with Sims is the same thing as micing an amp.
And why is it in 2020 people are still in love with analog gear?
Because they like the sound better. But the thing is, I mean, look, analog has its own sound, digital has its own sound. If you're recording the Snot Puppy Punk Band from San Diego, it sounds really good on tape. If you're recording a Bach violin partita, it's going to sound much better on digital. You know, you have to choose the appropriate. I mean, because tape, you know, people talk about tape as if it's some holy thing. It's a signal processor. They happen to like that signal processor. But if you look at what tape does, I mean, it's really pretty horrible. It gives you those head bumps. It gives you phase issues. It starts distorting at -20 if you feed a sine wave in. You know, I mean, it's, you know, it's got all these issues. And so if you look at it from a technical standpoint, you go, well, God, this sucks, you know. But people like that signal processor. I mean, analog sounds fine. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I used analog stuff all my life. And I still have some analog units around, but they get less and less used all the time because I can't take them as far as I can take the digital stuff.
So at the end of the day, gear is gear, whether it's analog or digital. If it works for you, use it. There's nothing stopping you from getting a really killer guitar tone out of a digital amp. And coming up next, Craig's going to tell you how to do just that. But before he does, if this video or any of our videos has helped you or your band in any way, please consider joining our Metal Army by pledging your support on our Patreon at patreon.com/Lords of the Trident. And if you haven't yet hit like or subscribe on the video, please do so. It helps us out a lot. Okay, over to Craig.
The thing is, in my experience, it takes a lot of effort to get an amp sim to sound really good. And something that, I mean, if you just put an amp sim, if you just insert an amp sim and expect it to sound good, it probably isn't. Like the two main things that there are a couple things I do to help make amp sims sound better. One is I pre-filter it. I put a low pass and a high pass in front of it to take out all the lows and most of the highs. Most of the highs above like 5 kHz, most of the lows below 100 hertz. And that trims the amount of crap that you expect the amp to have to deal with. And getting rid of those high frequencies is particularly crucial because one of the things about a physical amp is it doesn't really do anything above 5 kHz. See, what people forget is that a cabinet is not a cabinet, it's a mechanical filter. So you want to be able to have that same kind of filtering with a sim. And filtering it at the sim itself is one thing, but filtering before it goes into the sim is even better. One difference with amp sims compared to physical amps is that the amp sim lives within the computer, and the computer places no constraints on frequency response. If you have incredible amounts of distortion, it's very easy to generate signals that are above the clock frequency of the recording program, and you get aliasing, foldback distortion, and all these nasty sounds. So you want to restrict that. You don't want that to happen. The other thing I do is I typically use a notch filter at the output, like a steep notch, because you'll find that people don't listen to amps by sticking their ear 2 inches away from the speaker. You know, amp sims are part of a room. Amp sims are part of a system. And a lot of sim emulations that I've heard have what I call the annoying frequency, you know, and it's like you can find it by using EQ afterward, turning the boost way up, narrow bandwidth, moving the frequency back and forth, and you'll find a space where all of a sudden it gets incredibly distorted and nasty. And if you just cut back at that frequency, you get rid of the annoying sound. It's a much creamier, it's a much more gorgeous sound. Another thing that I do is I'll use a de-esser in front of the amp sim, so that you know, guitarists know that when you pull back the tone control, it gets sweeter, you know, when you're using high gain distortion. And this basically does it in an intelligent way. If you're hitting it really hard, it's going to pull back a bit on the highs. And then, of course, I have my transient tamer, which is a mechanical limiter that goes before the audio interface, which gets rid of a lot of the really nasty pick noise and sounds that amp sims don't like. So you can say, okay, well, that's a lot of work. But to me, once I've done all those things, then to my ears, the amp sim actually sounds better than the amp. So when I play that sound back for people, they're like, well, obviously that's not an amp sim, you know, because it sounds really good.
Big, gigantic thanks to Craig Anderton for helping us out with this video. Please go check out all of his amazing knowledge at craiganderton.org. I'm leaving links to all of his projects in the video below, his books, his YouTube channel. Go check it out, especially if you want to hear that amazing multi-band tone that he was talking about. Thanks again for watching. We will see you next time. If you don't subscribe to Lords of the Trident, you are probably never gonna get laid, yeah. Never, 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 never gonna get laid in your life, baby. Yeah, that's right.